They blocked his driveway, mocked his protests, and turned his peaceful life into a daily battle of frustration and humiliation. Mark, the arrogant new neighbor, claimed the street as his personal domain, parking his oversized truck wherever he pleased and ignoring James's pleas for fairness. Confident in his ability to get away with anything, Mark even went so far as to barricade James's property, declaring it private territory. What Mark didn't know was that James, a steadfast veteran with a deep sense of justice, wasn't about to back down. Armed with determination, a neighborhood united by shared grievances, and a plan to expose the truth, James set out to reclaim not just his driveway, but the respect and peace his community deserved. What followed was a courtroom showdown and a reckoning that no one saw coming. But let's start from the beginning. James Hunter was the kind of man people admired, an upstanding veteran, a loving husband, and a father who had worked tirelessly to provide for his family. His corner lot home, with its neat picket fence and perfectly trimmed lawn, was the pride of the neighborhood. For years, this small suburban street had been his sanctuary, a place where kids rode bikes, neighbors waved hello, and peace reigned supreme. But all of that was about to change. It started innocently enough. One sunny Saturday morning, James noticed a large black pickup truck parked awkwardly across his driveway. The vehicle was massive, like something out of a car commercial, and it completely blocked his way out. He sighed, thinking it must belong to one of the movers helping the new neighbor across the street. Stepping outside, James waved and introduced himself to the man unloading boxes. "Hi, I'm James from across the street. Welcome to the neighborhood." His voice was warm, genuinely welcoming. The man, who introduced himself as Mark Taylor, barely looked up. "Yeah, thanks," Mark muttered, not even offering a handshake. James glanced at the truck. "Hey, I hate to be that guy, but your truck's blocking my driveway. Could you move it a bit?" Mark shrugged. "I'll get to it later. I'm busy right now." He turned his back and continued unloading. James stood there for a moment, stunned. Maybe he's just having a rough day, James thought, trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. But that shrug, that dismissive, almost contemptuous shrug, stuck with him. Later that evening, when the truck was still there, James knocked on Mark's door. No answer. By the time Mark finally moved the vehicle the next morning, James was already late for an early church meeting. Annoying, sure, but not the end of the world. At least, that's what James told himself. But then it happened again and again. Every few days, Mark's truck would reappear, always in the same spot, completely blocking James's driveway. James tried being polite, leaving notes on the windshield. He even tried catching Mark in person to talk it out. Each time, Mark either ignored him or gave him the same dismissive wave. "Relax, it's not a big deal," he'd say, as if James's time and property didn't matter. And it wasn't just the truck. Mark had a way of treating the whole street like his personal kingdom. Loud music blared late into the night. Empty beer cans mysteriously appeared on James's lawn. But it was the driveway issue that drove James to the brink. One particularly frustrating morning, as he struggled to maneuver his car around Mark's truck, James scratched his bumper on a street lamp. That was the final straw. Standing in his driveway, staring at the damage, James felt anger bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just about the truck. It was about respect, about boundaries, and Mark had crossed them one too many times. Looking across the street at Mark's house, James made a silent vow. If Mark wasn't going to respect him, then it was time to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. The morning was crisp, with the golden sunlight filtering through the trees, promising a peaceful day. James sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, staring out at the obstructed view of his driveway. Mark's truck stood there like a monument to disregard, its glossy black paint gleaming smugly in the morning light. James sighed heavily, placing his cup down with a thud. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was a daily reminder that his home, his sanctuary, was no longer his own. Determined to keep the peace, James grabbed a notepad and pen. His handwriting, neat and deliberate, reflected his measured temperament. The note read, "Hi, Mark. I noticed your truck is blocking my driveway again. Could you please park it elsewhere? Thanks, James." He folded the note carefully and walked outside, the cool air biting at his skin as he placed the paper under the windshield wiper of Mark's truck. For a brief moment, James felt hopeful. Surely, a direct yet polite approach would resolve the issue. But later that afternoon, as he stepped outside to check, his heart sank. The truck was still there, unmoved, with his note crumpled on the windshield. Worse yet, written in bold, messy letters across it were the words, "My Street." James clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening as a wave of frustration surged through him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "This can't go on," he muttered under his breath. His wife, Sarah, watched from the doorway, concern etched on her face. "Maybe you should call the police," she suggested softly. James hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man to involve authorities over small disputes, but this was more than a small inconvenience. The next day, James called the local police department. The officers arrived promptly, their flashing lights drawing the attention of curious neighbors. Mark stepped out of his house, arms crossed and a smirk plastered on his face. "He's always complaining," Mark said dismissively to the officers, jerking a thumb toward James. "It's not like I'm breaking any laws." The officers examined the situation and, to James's dismay, informed him that the local parking regulations were ambiguous. "Technically, he's not violating any ordinances," one officer explained, his tone apologetic. They gave Mark a verbal warning, but left James with little else. Mark's smirk grew wider as the police car pulled away. He turned to James, his voice dripping with mockery. "Nice try, old man. Guess you're not as important as you think." The words stung, not just because they were meant to, but because they carried a sense of smug victory. That evening, James sat in his living room, staring blankly at the television, while the faint thrum of Mark's music seeped through the walls. The sound grated on his nerves like nails on a chalkboard. He felt a mixture of anger and helplessness, a combination he hadn't experienced in years. But James wasn't the kind of man to give up. The next day, with a determined expression, he visited the local hardware store and purchased a set of surveillance cameras. If Mark wanted to play games, James would be ready. With the help of his daughter, Emily, a tech-savvy college student, he installed the cameras strategically around his property, ensuring every angle was covered. "Now we'll have proof," Emily said with a reassuring smile as she adjusted one of the cameras. Her confidence gave James a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, James began drafting a formal complaint to the local municipality. It was a slow, tedious process, bogged down by bureaucratic red tape. Days turned into weeks, and while James waited for any response, Mark seemed to double down on his antics. His truck became a permanent fixture in front of James's driveway, and his weekend parties grew louder and more disruptive. James's neighbors started to share their frustrations in hushed tones. "It's getting out of hand," one of them said, shaking her head, but none of them were willing to confront Mark directly, leaving James to shoulder the burden alone. Despite the growing tension, James remained steadfast. Each night, as he reviewed the footage from his cameras and updated his complaint, he reminded himself of the values that had guided him throughout his life: perseverance, justice, and standing up for what's right. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to reclaim the peace and respect he deserved. The morning air was cool and still as James stepped outside, holding a fresh cup of coffee. For a brief moment, the quiet of the neighborhood felt almost serene. But as he approached his driveway, the sight before him turned his calm into a wave of disbelief and anger. Mark's massive truck was there, as usual, but now it was joined by a set of orange traffic cones and a makeshift barricade made of old wooden planks and bricks. James stood frozen, the steam from his coffee curling up into the chilly air. On one of the cones, written in bold black letters, were the words, "Private property, keep out." His driveway was entirely blocked. He could feel his pulse quicken as he approached the barricade, his jaw tightening. The audacity of it all left him momentarily speechless. How could someone think they could just take over someone else's space like this? James took a deep breath and marched across the street to Mark's house. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the still morning. Mark opened the door, leaning casually against the frame with a smirk. "Morning, James. Something wrong?" he asked, his tone dripping with feigned innocence. "What is this, Mark?" James gestured toward the barricade. "You've gone too far this time. You're blocking me in completely." Mark shrugged. "It's my street, James. I need the space for my projects. You've got other ways to get out, don't you?" James felt his patience snap. "This isn't your street, Mark. It's public property and you're blocking access to my home. Move it, now." Mark didn't flinch. "Do what you gotta do," he said with a grin, before shutting the door in James's face. James stood there for a moment, his fists clenched, before turning back to his house. He wasn't just angry, he was determined. This wasn't going to be another incident he'd let slide. It was time to take real action. That evening, James called for a meeting with his neighbors. He went door to door, explaining the situation, and to his surprise, many of them were all too familiar with Mark's behavior. "He's always blaring music late at night," one neighbor said, shaking her head. "He backed into my mailbox last month and never apologized," another chimed in. "My kids can't even play outside without him yelling at them to stay off his grass," someone added. James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they could make a stand. The group gathered in James's living room, a mix of frustration and hope in the air. James laid out his plan. They would document everything. Photos of Mark's barricades, videos of his disruptive behavior, and testimonies from every neighbor willing to speak up. "I know it feels like he's untouchable," James said, looking around the room, "but if we work together, we can show that his actions aren't just inconvenient, they're illegal." One of the neighbors, an older man named Robert, who used to work as a lawyer, stepped forward. "I can help draft a formal complaint," he said. "If we gather enough evidence, we can take this to the city council, or even file a civil suit if necessary." Over the next few days, the neighborhood came alive with quiet determination. Cameras were adjusted to capture Mark's truck and barricades from every angle. Neighbors took turns recording his loud parties, collecting timestamps and decibel readings. James compiled a growing folder of evidence, each piece more damning than the last. Even Emily, James's daughter, played a role. She created a detailed map of the street, marking areas where Mark had encroached on others' property. "This will make it easier for the council to see the pattern," she explained. As the evidence piled up, so did the neighbors' confidence. What had once felt like an isolated battle now felt like a collective effort. For the first time in weeks, James felt hope. They weren't just standing up to Mark, they were reclaiming their neighborhood. And Mark? He seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him, but James knew that wouldn't last. The next step was coming, and this time, it wouldn't end with a shrug or a smirk. The day of the court hearing arrived, and James woke up early, his mind racing with both nerves and determination. He dressed carefully, choosing a suit that his wife Sarah had pressed the night before. "You've got this," she said, squeezing his hand as he picked up the thick folder containing weeks of evidence. The courthouse was a grand building, its marble steps gleaming in the morning sun. As James entered, he saw Mark strutting through the hallway, looking relaxed, as if he were on his way to a casual meeting rather than facing legal consequences. Mark's confidence was unnerving, but James took a deep breath and reminded himself of the solid case he had built with the help of his neighbors. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet chatter as neighbors filtered in, eager to see the outcome. James looked around and felt a swell of gratitude. Nearly every seat was filled with people who had come to support him. When the hearing began, Mark's lawyer started with a casual dismissal of the claims. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing dismissively, "these so-called grievances are overblown. My client's actions have caused no real harm. This is a matter of petty neighborhood disputes, not something worth wasting the court's time over." Mark nodded smugly, leaning back in his chair as if the outcome were already decided. But James's lawyer, Robert, his retired neighbor turned ally, rose with calm confidence. "Your Honor," Robert began, "we intend to prove that Mr. Taylor's actions were not only disruptive but deliberately targeted and harmful to my client and the community." Robert methodically presented the evidence. Photos of Mark's truck blocking driveways, videos showing the barricades Mark had erected with timestamps and angles that left no room for doubt, statements from neighbors about property damage and noise complaints. The room was silent as one piece of evidence after another painted a clear picture of Mark's repeated disregard for others. Mark's expression shifted from smug to defensive. "This is ridiculous," he interjected. "I wasn't hurting anyone. It's my right to park wherever I want." The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, raised her hand to silence him. Mr. Taylor, you will have your turn to speak, she said firmly. When it was Mark's turn, he stood and tried to defend himself. Your Honor, he began, his voice tinged with irritation. I've been a hard-working man my whole life. I don't see why a little parking issue has to turn into this circus. He gestured broadly to the room, as if the entire situation were beneath him. Nobody was really harmed. This is just people blowing things out of proportion. The judge leaned forward, her gaze steady. Mr. Taylor, the evidence presented today suggests otherwise. Blocking someone's driveway, erecting unauthorized barricades, and creating a hostile environment for your neighbors are not little issues. As she spoke, Mark's confidence visibly crumbled. He glanced nervously at the growing stack of evidence on the judge's bench. After hours of testimony and cross-examinations, the judge delivered her verdict. Mr. Taylor, your actions have shown a pattern of disregard for community standards and personal property rights. You are hereby ordered to remove all barricades and to cease blocking driveways immediately. Additionally, you will pay a fine for violating local ordinances and compensate Mr. Hunter for legal fees and damages. The room erupted in quiet murmurs of approval. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, justice was on his side. But Mark wasn't ready to admit defeat. I'll appeal this, he declared loudly, standing up so abruptly that his chair scraped across the floor. This isn't over. The judge's expression remained neutral, but her next words silenced the room. You are, of course, entitled to appeal, Mr. Taylor. However, given the overwhelming evidence against you, I doubt another court will reach a different conclusion. Mark's outburst drew a few stifled chuckles from the audience. Even the bailiff cracked a small smile as he gestured for Mark to sit down. As the hearing adjourned, James stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by neighbors offering their congratulations and thanks. You did it, James, one of them said, clapping him on the shoulder. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself a genuine smile. The fight had been exhausting, but standing there with his community, he realized it had all been worth it. Together, they had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, they had reclaimed the peace and respect their neighborhood deserved. As for Mark, he left the courthouse looking deflated, his confidence replaced by a sour scowl. It was clear to everyone watching that his days of unchecked behavior were over. The weeks following the court's decision brought a noticeable change to the neighborhood. Mark, now under legal obligation, quietly removed his barricades one chilly morning, the sound of scraping wood and clattering bricks echoing through the quiet street. His truck, once a permanent fixture in front of James's driveway, was finally parked in his own driveway where it belonged. For the first time in months, James walked outside and found his path clear. The sight filled him with a deep, quiet satisfaction, like the first breath of fresh air after a storm. The neighbors noticed the change, too. The once tense atmosphere had given way to a sense of calm and renewal. Inspired by James's perseverance, the community came together to discuss ways to prevent such conflicts in the future. On a bright Saturday afternoon, a group of them gathered at James's home. The warm smell of coffee and pastries filled the living room as they brainstormed solutions. I think we need a formal committee, said Robert, the retired lawyer who had been instrumental in James's victory. Nothing too rigid, just something to address concerns before they escalate. The others nodded in agreement. James, sitting quietly at the head of the table, listened with a small smile. He was proud of how his neighbors were rallying together, turning a divisive conflict into an opportunity for unity. As the committee took shape, they decided on a set of simple rules to ensure fairness and respect within the community. Volunteers stepped forward to serve as mediators, promising to address disputes with patience and understanding. It wasn't just about rules. It was about creating a neighborhood where everyone felt valued and heard. Meanwhile, Mark kept a low profile. Though he had made noises about appealing the decision, it was clear that he lacked the support to follow through. The few neighbors who still spoke to him said he seemed subdued, even regretful. Whether or not he had truly learned his lesson, the changes in his behavior were undeniable. For James, the victory was more than just the return of his driveway. It was a reaffirmation of his values, his belief that standing up for what's right could lead to meaningful change. One afternoon, as he stood in his garage sorting through some old tools, Sarah came in holding an envelope. This came for you, she said, handing it to him. James opened it to find a handwritten note from the new neighborhood committee. Inside was a framed letter of thanks, signed by every neighbor who had supported him. The words were simple, but heartfelt. To James Hunter, whose courage and perseverance brought us together. Thank you for reminding us that we are stronger as a community. James felt a lump in his throat as he read the letter. He glanced at Sarah, who gave him a knowing smile. Together, they found the perfect spot for it on the wall of his study, next to his military medals and family photographs. The letter was more than just an acknowledgement of his efforts. It was a symbol of what they had achieved together. That evening, James sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. He could hear the faint laughter of children playing down the street, the distant hum of neighbors chatting as they tended their gardens. The neighborhood felt alive again, its spirit restored. As the cool evening breeze ruffled his hair, James allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He had faced a daunting challenge and come out stronger, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. The fight had been worth it, and the peace that followed was a reward he would treasure for years to come. And so, the story of James Hunter's wasn't just a tale of one man's stand against injustice. It was a reminder that even the most stubborn challenges can be overcome when people come together, united by a shared sense of fairness and respect. In the end, justice had prevailed, and the neighborhood was better for it.